Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session. I'm quite excited for our session today addressing anti-Semitism in healthcare. This session marks the beginning of what I hope is an informational but also transformative way to approach the delivery of healthcare for a diverse patient population. Just before we get started, a couple of housekeeping matters that I'd like to address. First and foremost, if you have any other platforms or applications running in the background, you may want to close them down because it will improve the connectivity for today's session. If you are experiencing technical issues, I would encourage you to exit, shut your system down, and then log back in. If you continue to experience technical issues, please reach out to me and I will be monitoring emails as well. Today's session will be recorded and posted on CASLPO's website in about 2 to 3 weeks, and today's presentation is intended for educational purposes. I want to also remind our watchers today that some of the content may be difficult to hear, it may be triggering, or it may be difficult to absorb. And so we want you to be mindful of how you are feeling during our presentation today. Know that the session will be recorded, and if you do need to take a moment to step back, you can visit the recording later, and staff are always happy to answer any questions that you may have after the fact. I will be monitoring questions in the chat feature today, so please feel free to enter any questions that you have, and we will try to get to as many questions live today as possible. With that in mind, we have a 60-minute presentation for you with 30 minutes set aside for a question period. We really wanted to ensure that you had the opportunity to engage with our presenters today, and so we've set aside that extra time. I am very excited to introduce our speakers today. As you will have seen from our email, Dr. Joanna Krongold is a joint postdoctoral fellow and has investigated anti-Semitism in healthcare profession education. She also researches and teaches about the rise of anti-Semitism during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Ayelet Cooper is an associate professor who has published over 90 peer-reviewed papers, many of which relate to power, equity, inclusion, and social justice. She is frequently asked to speak on these topics, both domestically and internationally. And Dr. Ariel Lefkowitz is an internal medicine physician, is an assistant professor, and is the lead for novel education sessions at the Faculty of Medicine on religious discrimination in healthcare. All of our speakers today come to us from the University of Toronto's Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies. With that incredibly short introduction, I pass the mic over to our speakers today to take us through today's topic, addressing anti-Semitism in healthcare.
So I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of the land on which we work, study, and live. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which your hosts and organizers work at the University of Toronto, at the Toronto Academic Health Science Network, and also upon which CASLPO is located. And these precede the establishment of any of these institutions. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Today, this land is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and gather on these territories. We acknowledge that Toronto, where today's webinar hosts and panelists are physically located, is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. As Jews, we are grateful for the ways in which this land provided a safe haven for those of our ancestors who managed to reach its shores, often fleeing hatred and death elsewhere in the diaspora. We thank the nations on whose land we now live for their generosity in sharing that land with us and providing us with this place of safety. As a people that knows what it means to be targeted for extinction and to nonetheless endure with strength and courage, we are bound by our understanding of trauma and survival to commit to the ongoing work of reconciliation, of tikkun olam. Land acknowledgements are only a starting point for larger conversations. For those of you who want to learn more about Indigenous history and culture, I encourage you to consider doing so through courses like the Sanyas online training program or the free Indigenous Canada online course run by the University of Alberta. These resources provide opportunities to critically engage in discussions about colonization, land rights, language, and Indigenous history. Such ongoing learning and unlearning can also help us understand the concrete acts of restitution and transformation that are needed to address underlying inequities and blatant discrimination in the distribution of resources between this land's first peoples and its settlers. And with that, I will hand over to Dr. Lefkowitz and Dr. Krongold to continue.
Thank you, Ayelet, and thank you, Priya. Good afternoon. My name is Ariel Lefkowitz, as you heard, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Dr. Joanna Krongold, who, as a PhD researcher on related topics, is the real expert in the field, but I'll be here too. Our duty today is to address a tough but timely and important subject, anti-Semitism in healthcare, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you today. And today's talk seems even more timely right now, as we're currently within the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement for Jewish people, a time of reflection and change, and perhaps the perfect opportunity to reflect on our beliefs and how we interact with others and how we can do better in the year to come. Our goals today are to contextualize the problem of anti-Semitism in society at large and in our local healthcare settings, to appreciate how a 2,000-year history of hateful stereotypes and narratives about Jews still inform the prejudice we face today, and most importantly, discuss what we as individuals and as a collective can do to fight against anti-Semitism to protect our Jewish patients and colleagues. Content warning, as you heard from Priya as well, this material is definitely upsetting and definitely difficult to talk about. We will discuss quotes and see images that are inflammatory and very hurtful that may trigger an emotional response. Please feel absolutely free to step away if you need to. But we'll try to convince you that this is a very important session, one whose lessons have the capacity to significantly inform our approach to practicing medicine with a thoughtful, insightful, and inclusive perspective.
Before we begin, I think it's important for all of us to acknowledge our positions of privilege as scholars and educators. As a white presenting academic, I'm very aware of the opportunities that have been afforded to me to pursue the study of discrimination and genocide. When I was doing my PhD in the Department of English and the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto, I was granted the time and the space to pursue my research on Holocaust literature for young people, a topic that has been incredibly important to me since I myself was a child. But one thing I did notice while I was doing my doctoral research is that oftentimes when I told people the subject of my work, the Holocaust, they would say, oh, you should really study XYZ, something else, a different historical event, a different period of literature, a different experience of oppression or genocide. And I am not by any means saying this to detract from any of those other topics, which are worthy and necessary avenues of research. But I'm instead trying to highlight the way in which Holocaust studies or anti-Semitism studies has been viewed in recent years. And what's interesting and also I think disturbing as an indicator of the times in which we live is that I don't get those exact comments as much anymore, because I think it has become clear that anti-Semitism is an expansive and an ever-expanding problem, one that requires urgent attention and study in order to understand strategies of interrupting it. So both Ariel, Ayelet, and I are all very grateful for the chance to be speaking about this pressing topic with you today.
This topic, anti-Semitism in healthcare, is both one that's of particular interest to me as well, and also for some of the same reasons, one that's particularly difficult for me to talk about. So as you heard, I'm an internal medicine physician working at Sunnybrook Hospital, where I'm also the education lead for my division. I am sometimes white passing and have many privileges that come from the way that I look and my socioeconomic status. I'm an assistant professor at U of T, as you heard, and teach med students about religious discrimination in healthcare and about lessons for physicians from the Holocaust, among other topics. This history is not just history for me. This history is my history. Both my grandmothers were Holocaust survivors, surviving Auschwitz, a death camp where over 1 million people were murdered by the Nazis. My father's mother lost her mother, father, and most of her siblings. She and her sister, the second and third children pictured on the left, stuck together and survived, came to Canada, raised their families a block from each other, and lived in the same retirement home until my grandmother's death a few years ago. My mother's mother and her two sisters, pictured on the right, stuck together through the death camps, through the horror, and survived. Their parents and siblings were murdered just for being Jewish, including their 3-year-old younger brother, whom I am named after. So this topic, anti-Semitism, prejudice, and hate of the Jews, has completely shaped my family, my understanding of my place in the world, and as we will see, is more relevant now than in recent memory, unfortunately. Then why is this talk so uncomfortable for me to give? Though anti-Jewish racism is one of the oldest forms of hate in the world, and though anti-Semitic sentiment and attacks are rising, as Joanna alluded to, Jews are typically quite uncomfortable talking about anti-Semitism. For one, anti-Semitism is often excluded from equity, diversity, and inclusion portfolios, though, of course, we are so grateful to have been invited to give this webinar as part of CASLPO's equity portfolio. In contrast with other groups, Jews claiming discrimination are often dismissed as complainers trying to draw attention away from other structurally marginalized groups, as Jews are falsely labeled as privileged and undeserving of sympathy. For another, Jews that speak out against anti-Semitism sometimes become targets of anti-Semitism. In the wake of Kanye West's many recent comments last year promoting hatred of Jews, the LA Holocaust Museum invited him to visit them and learn about the history of the consequences of anti-Semitism. He very publicly declined, and thereafter the LA Holocaust Museum became a target of a tremendous amount of hate speech, vitriol, even threats. Because of this, Jewish people often suffer in silence in the face of anti-Semitism. An even more recent example from this month is when the Anti-Defamation League called out anti-Semitism on what used to be called Twitter, and then faced a great deal of online hate, including the boosting of anti-Semitic viewpoints by none other than the CEO and owner of Twitter, Elon Musk. But I am an educator, and I take that responsibility very seriously. So Joanna and Ayelet and I are here to do the uncomfortable work of advocating on behalf of our own community. And thank you so much for having us here to speak today. I'd like to start by sharing two relatively recent personal stories of anti-Semitism from the wards. One is honestly funny, and one I found deeply disturbing. The first occurred at Sunnybrook when I went in to meet a patient whose care I had just taken over. I said, "I hear you're improving. That's wonderful. Sounds like you'll be ready to go to rehab soon." He said gruffly, "You'd better not send me to that Jewish rehab Baycrest again. Last time I was there, they tried to turn me into a Jew." I was taken aback, but feeling feisty, so I replied, "Oh yeah? Did it work?" And he said, "No." I said, "So what are you so worried about then?" The second occurred at Mount Sinai Hospital, where I had been caring for a patient for 2 weeks, feeling like I was going the extra mile for her, sitting by her bedside, encouraging her to eat, personally making sure that specialists came across from Princess Margaret Hospital to see her, really doing everything I could to help her get better. Which is part of why I was so dismayed when her son said to me, "My family thinks that since Jews in Israel are at war with the Muslim Arabs, and since Jews control the world, that you as a Jewish doctor are secretly hurting my mother. It would be easier if your name was something like John Smith instead of Ariel Lefkowitz. What should I tell them?" he asked me. I told him that I do everything I can to help his mother, just as I do for all my patients. But that feeling that I could be perceived as sinister and evil just because of my name and religious and ethnic background, that feeling has been very hard for me to shake. And this sort of experience is unfortunately not uncommon even for members of CASLPO, one of whom reached out before our session to share a story of when a client's parent refused to accept treatment from the practitioner because the practitioner was Jewish. I'll continue to mention stories we've received from colleagues throughout our talk when relevant. This is unfortunately relevant to us all. I'll add one more story of anti-Semitism from my civilian life, mostly because it happened so recently and has also stayed with me. On Yom Kippur, as I mentioned, the holiest day of the year in Judaism, which was, now we're coming up on its anniversary this Sunday, my family and I attended services in a park in Toronto. It was lovely, quiet, beautiful, and meaningful until, and please excuse my quoted language here, a man's voice shouted from behind us, "Fuck the Jews!" It was very, very unsettling. It made us feel unsafe in our city, close to my house. It made me wonder whether it was a bad idea to return to the park for the evening service, whether we were about to get shot up by an anti-Semitic terrorist, as happened in Pittsburgh in 2018 at the Tree of Life Synagogue, where a white supremacist gunman murdered 11 people and injured 6 others for being Jewish. That fear of being attacked for being Jewish is even worse for those who wear clothing that identifies them as Jewish, like a kippah, which is a skull cap worn by religious Jewish men, or a tichel, which is a head covering worn by religious Jewish married women. You may have seen religious Jewish people with other religiously affiliated clothing or hairstyles, like side curls called payas or peyot, long beards, black hats or furry hats called shtreimels. They feel the eyes of those around them every day, wondering whether they are being negatively perceived. And that day in the park, I felt that fear grab me. To feel so unsafe in a park near my house with my family. It was a fear that sadly connected me to my ancestors and to Jews around the world. So let's start with the most basic questions. Why is this session even necessary? Isn't learning about anti-Semitism redundant? Isn't it covered by all the other teaching on equity and anti-oppression that we do? Answer, no. We will see many of the same principles at play, but anti-Semitism has a different history, manifests in different ways, and is captured by different concepts. In addition, anti-Semitism, as I alluded to, is often excluded from educational topics that you might expect it would be included in. So because of this false perception of Jews as more powerful and privileged, folks wanting to fight inequitable power through social justice often misguidedly engage in anti-Semitism in excluding anti-Semitism from being taught in EDI spaces. Even when EDI is included in teaching about equity and social justice, some EDI folks don't feel comfortable teaching about it, or it's taught not from a Jewish perspective, or in some instances, we've heard EDI folks insist that it be taught by the right kind of Jew. One example from my own life is when I was part of launching the session for the med students at U of T on Holocaust education. There were many med students who protested, saying, why don't we learn about just genocide in general? Why should we learn about genocide of that privileged group of people? In doing so, expressing the sentiment that Jews are not worthy of sympathy, even when murdered by the millions, which of course in history led to, among other things, the Holocaust itself. Second question, is it even actually a problem? This is an easy one. Yep, it's a problem. So this is from the 2021 police report on hate crimes in Toronto. You can see that almost 30% of hate crimes are on the basis of religion, and on the right you'll see those hate crimes broken down by victimized group, with the plurality of hate crimes committed against Jews, 22% of all hate crimes, despite Jews only comprising 3.8% of the total Toronto population. Anti-Semitism is on the rise in recent years, as we mentioned, with anti-Semitic rhetoric more common among politicians and celebrities, and violent and non-violent attacks against Jews rising higher and higher over the past decade. In 2021, Statistics Canada found that police-reported hate crimes targeting Jews were up 47%. Okay, so why does this matter to healthcare? Well, perhaps the most straightforward answer is, unfortunately, that anti-Semitism exists here in Toronto, and of course around Ontario. In advance of this lecture and similar lectures we've given elsewhere, Jewish colleagues reached out to us to share stories of anti-Semitism they encountered at hospitals around Toronto and gave us permission to include them in our talk. As I mentioned, we'll intersperse them when they're relevant. But also it matters to healthcare at large because unfortunately religious discrimination in healthcare is common, and it results in worse health outcomes for those marginalized or targeted in this way, worse mental health, and those marginalized by religious discrimination don't seek out healthcare as often when needed. Here's a prominent example of how public policy affects the health of Jews and other minority religious groups. So Bill 21, La Loi 21, the Quebec ban on religious symbols, passed in June 2019, not a long time ago. It banned public employees from wearing religious symbols at work, including kippahs, hijabs, turbans, crucifixes, etc. This affects judges, lawyers, teachers, the police, other public employees. However, notably, the Premier initially exempted the crucifix in the National Assembly from being removed. He argued that it was a secular historical symbol, not a religious symbol, so it wasn't subject to the religious symbols ban. He reversed this decision after an outcry, but you can see how what is considered normal is invisible and what is considered different is stigmatized. This ban on employees wearing religious symbols is still in effect today. and it threatens the health of minorities like religious Jews in various ways, reducing access to public services, limiting those communities from having a supportive voice inside the establishment, increasing marginalization and hate crimes, etc. But it's worth pausing and understanding where prejudice against Jews comes from, what anti-Semitism means, and what drives it. And with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague Joanna to discuss precisely that.
Thanks so much, Ariel. And I want to start off by discussing what anti-Semitism actually is. A lot of confusion actually comes up around the word, and it's important to have a clear understanding of what anti-Semitism means and how it manifests so that we can identify and combat it in our workplaces, our schools, and our social spaces. So anti-Semitism is prejudice, discrimination, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews. This can express itself in many different ways, from assumptions about someone's wealth or status to views about conspiracy theories that Jews want to control the world for their own nefarious purposes. At its heart, anti-Semitism, like other forms of racism, is an unjust discrimination against and about Jewish people based on false beliefs that can have harmful and even deadly effects. Now, you've probably encountered a number of different spellings of the word anti-Semitism as well, and these differences might seem unimportant, but actually have a large impact on what is intended and what is received when discussing this topic. So, should anti-Semitism be capitalized? Should there be a hyphen? We argue no to both. This is because the hyphen suggests that an anti-Semite is someone who is against a group of people called Semites. In fact, there is no such category. The word Semitic is a linguistics term used to describe a certain group of languages with similar origins, such as Arabic, Hebrew, and Aramaic. It is not a racial nor a religious category. So unless you are for some reason opposed to the linguistic classification, then being anti-Semitic simply doesn't make sense. The origin of the term was actually grounded in a desire to single out and persecute Jews as a racial category and represents its own phenomenon, which is why keeping it as one word makes sense and why the hyphen is unnecessary. Finally, we follow the scholar Deborah Lipstadt in using a lowercase a in our spelling of anti-Semitism, unless it's at the beginning of a sentence, of course. As Professor Lipstadt says, a hatred as absurd and illogical as anti-Semitism does not deserve a capital letter. So you might be asking yourself, isn't anti-Semitism about Judaism as a religion? How can it even be compared to racism? Anti-Semitism is not just a religious, but also a racial prejudice, and that's very important to keep in mind. In fact, although anti-Jewish sentiment has been around for thousands of years, the term anti-Semitism originated in the 19th century from the German word antisemitismus. This was an invented term used to describe hatred of the Jews that characterized not only the religious nature of the discrimination, but also the ethnic and racial nature of it. One could convert from Judaism to another religion and still be considered Jewish. So the word anti-Semitism put forth the idea that there was something innate or essential about Jewishness, potentially separate from Judaism, the religion itself, and that something made Jews worthy targets of persecution. This is one of the troubling and very complex issues associated with anti-Semitism today. It is certainly a form of religious discrimination, but it is also much more than that. Ethnicity and nationality come into play as well, but it is the social constructions of race that are most prominently on display in anti-Semitic rhetoric and belief. Jews were seen as separate from the dominant white Christian majority, and as such were persecuted along racial lines as well as religious ones. Of course, at this point, I have to point out that there is no one way to be Jewish. There are Jews of varying degrees of religiosity and community involvement, varying degrees of wealth and social status. In fact, 25% of Jews in Toronto live below the poverty line. There are Jews of color, around 1/3 of American Jews in a recent poll. There are queer Jews, there are disabled Jews, etc. So the intersection of multiple identity groups really represents the diversity of Jewishness out there. But unfortunately, it also represents the diversity of anti-Semitism that can intersect with other discriminations and hatreds. At its most basic level, then, anti-Semitism is about prejudice against or hatred of Jews. This can take many different forms, as you can see on the screen. Some of the most blatant forms include conspiracy theories, which I think we're all familiar with in this day and age, stereotyping, that is extrapolating prejudicial opinions based on assumed characteristics of Jews, scapegoating or blaming Jews for problems that they have nothing to do with, violence, hate speech, overt and covert exclusion, and being held accountable or responsible for the actions of other people or nations, most prominently Israel. As I mentioned, anti-Jewish discrimination and hatred has existed for thousands of years. It became prominent in the early days of Christianity, when many believed that Jews were responsible for the death of Christ. It's important to remember that these ideas were based not on fact, but on invented suppositions about power and control. As time went on, marginalization and hatred of Jews took on different forms. The medieval crusades targeting Muslims labeled infidels, and the Christian desire to seize power in Jerusalem and other holy sites led to the targeting of Jews in Europe and in the Middle East. When Jews sought lives and livelihoods in the diaspora, which means the Jewish community outside of Israel, accusations of blood libel began to appear in Europe. And blood libel is basically the false accusation that Jews murder someone of Christian faith, often a child, in order to use their blood for ritual purposes, to bake it into their Passover matzah, or to use it for other invented reasons. Persecution and even murder of Jews in the wake of these blood libel accusations led many European Jews to rightly fear pogroms, that is, violent riots targeting Jews for expulsion and massacre. Despite their relatively small numbers in mainstream populations, Jews were still feared, seen as gaining and consolidating too much power. In Venice, they were forced to live in ghettos, an Italian word originally applied to the enclosed Jewish neighborhoods separated from the rest of society. And one stereotype that many of you have probably encountered is the money-loving Jew. The origins of this view date to the time when Jews were barred from so-called respectable jobs, often left with the occupations that the dominant non-Jewish workforce did not want to take on themselves. One of these was money lending, a necessary job that nonetheless carried the reputation of being dirty and lowly. This then became another way to target Jews, to essentially force them into a certain position in society and then blame them for it. Once the association with money became accepted, new forms of conspiracy theory popped up, that Jews were money-obsessed, power-hungry, and devious. This transformed into the belief that Jews had no loyalty to their home countries, that they were cosmopolitan, international, out for control and power, and trying to disrupt the world order. All of these anti-Semitic beliefs laid the groundwork for Nazism, which would be the largest and deadliest example of anti-Semitism in human history. So why does all of this background information matter? It's important to remember that Hitler and the Nazis did not invent anti-Semitism, that they were drawing on centuries of precedent in the form of prejudice, violence, and even mass murder. Hatred of the Jews was already very much present in Europe and elsewhere, and this hatred was capitalized on to enact the murder of over 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. As you can probably tell by now, anti-Semitism at its core is based on a series of contradictions. Historically, Jews have been figured as both weak and powerful. So they were seen as poor, lazy thieves, lowering society to their level, but also seen as involved in a global conspiracy controlling the banks. They were called simultaneously communists and capitalists. And above all, they were seen as an inferior race. Nazi ideology positioned Jews as vermin, subhuman, disease-riddled parasites, but at the same time as incredibly insidiously powerful, infiltrating all aspects of German life and corrupting it. Versions of these stereotypes still exist in many different forms today, demonstrating the power of this kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric. This is something that the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is keen to highlight, especially in response to the growing far-right ethno-nationalism in North America and abroad today. The museum has said publicly that the Holocaust did not begin with killing, it began with words. And this has significance for us today as we see reverberation of some of those damaging words. Hatred and anti-Semitism are not problems that we can conveniently tuck away into a remote part of history. We know that words are powerful and that they have the potential to incite anger, violence, and genocide. And you can see evidence of that in this newspaper clipping from Der Stürmer, which was an anti-Semitic publication at the time. The caption reads, "The Jews are our misfortune." And the image shows an officer with a Nazi armband pumping poison into a rat-infested oak tree, essentially in order to kill the vermin, or the Jews, and to save the tree. And this was published in 1927, so it's 12 years before the start of World War II. Anti-Semitism was very much a part of European society. So the Nazis clearly viewed the Jews as a race, although not necessarily a race defined by skin color. And the issue of racial definitions is one that is still front and center in anti-Semitic discourse. Many white supremacists, for example, believe that Jews are not really white or not white enough. Beliefs about disloyalty, about being less than and more than, about power-hungry greed all come back into play here, as Jews are still seen as others, hiding in plain view and ready to undermine the white ethno-state. This prejudice is therefore not necessarily based on phenotypic diversity, but on other perceived racial attributes associated with Jewishness. On the other hand, Jews are often seen as too white in spaces that are devoted to anti-racism, although of course CASLPO is an exception. Because Jews are perceived as having white privilege, they are not understood as having to confront real racism. This is something we heard in stories from equity circles within the Toronto healthcare community. When Jewish people have voiced concern about anti-Semitism or shared experiences of diversity related to Jewishness, they have been told that their whiteness excludes them from participating in those spaces. Jews can therefore be seen as hyper-white, gaining the benefits of passing as white while also claiming marginalized status. This too is a social construction that ignores the exclusion of Jews from social justice forums, and in fact further excludes them from sharing their own lived experiences of anti-Semitism. To quote Pamela Peresky, in the critical social justice paradigm, Jews who have never been seen as white by those for whom being white is a moral good are now seen as white by those for whom whiteness is an unmitigated evil. This, of course, ignores the complicated ways that race operates, as well as the fact that many Jews are not white or not white passing at all. This is true of Angela Buchdahl, the rabbi of the Central Synagogue in New York City, and an Asian American woman. When an armed gunman entered the congregation Beth Israel Synagogue in Colleyville, Texas, just last year, holding those present hostage in an effort to barter for the release of an alleged Al-Qaeda operative, he called Rabbi Buchdahl on the phone several times during the hostage situation. This is because of the assumption that, as the rabbi of the Central Synagogue, Rabbi Buchdahl would have contact with the secret group of powerful Jewish leaders that influence the government and politics. So you can see how anti-Semitic stereotypes endure, continuing to morph and change, but maintaining their connection to those old harmful tropes. Discrimination is clearly not a zero-sum game. Jews are discriminated against in particular ways, just as Black people, Muslims, disabled people, queer people, the list goes on, are also discriminated against. Sometimes these kinds of discrimination intersect. At other times, they are unique with their own specific qualities. Just because one group experiences a form of racism does not mean that another group cannot also experience a form of racism, whether similar or distinct. These things unfortunately coexist, and I think it's vital to examine the ways in which they do. But the idea that from one end of the political spectrum, Jews are seen as not white enough, and from the other end, Jews are seen as too white, demonstrates once again the contradictions inherent in anti-Semitism. And lest we think that this anti-Semitism is at a historical or geographical remove from our present circumstances, U of T maintained anti-Semitic quotas in their Faculty of Medicine for years, for decades in the mid-20th century. Admission was halted after the quota had been reached, and hospitals in the city maintained strict rules about admitting only 1 or 2 Jews as residents or fellows in a given year. Anti-Semitism was built into the structures of society here in Toronto. Jews faced restrictions in pretty much all facets of daily life, including the practice of medicine, and many had to work twice as hard to achieve success, all while facing sometimes blatant discrimination. And now I'm going to pass the floor back to Ariel to discuss some of the important concepts in religious discrimination.
Thank you, Joanna. So I'll take us through a bit of religious discrimination theory and discuss 3 concepts that clarify the foundation of religious discrimination. Those are dominant religion centricity, secularism in healthcare, and narratives, worldviews, and conspiracy theories. So first, dominant religion centricity is the regarding of the dominant religion and its symbols and customs as normal. So like we saw with the crucifix in the Quebec National Assembly not being perceived as religious, the dominant religion becomes invisible through being perceived as normal, and other religions like Judaism become outsiders. So let's go over some examples of dominant religion centricity here in Canada. For example, many civic holidays are Christian religious holidays, and no other religion's holidays are civic holidays. So for example, places of work and commerce are usually closed on Christmas and Easter, but open on the holidays of other religions, like next Monday, which is Yom Kippur. Christian beliefs are foregrounded in secular societal traditions and practices. For example, you've heard "God keep our land glorious and free" in the Canadian national anthem, and the French version of the anthem actually mentions carrying the cross, porter la croix. In Ontario, Catholic schools are funded by the government like public schools, while other religious schools are not. Now, let me be very clear. The problem is not Christianity, and Christmas is not bad. It is fun. The problem is the structural factors that mainstream Christianity and exclude others. So in Saudi Arabia, civic holidays occur on Ramadan and Eid, and in Israel, civic holidays occur on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and they get the days off. Different countries have different dominant religions, and the cultural mainstream flows from it. So again, religious discrimination studies are not anti-Christian. They are focused on anti-oppression, and indeed religious Christians often find themselves the victims of religious discrimination as well, as we'll see in the next section. So what is the effect of this Christian hegemony? Religious minorities like Jews may feel marginalized. For example, being asked about your Christmas plans when your religious identity is non-Christian is not a big deal on its own, but repeated instances become reminders of one's outsider status. They may be disadvantaged, for example, if every event was held on Saturdays, which is the Jewish Sabbath, the day of rest, or at a restaurant that didn't serve kosher food. And the effect of being different than the mainstream can lead to harassment and sometimes frank exclusion from parts of society, as we saw in Quebec's secularism law. Number 2, secularism in healthcare culture. As you may have recognized, science and medicine exalt neutrality and impartiality. For years, healthcare workers have imagined themselves as impartial, neutral observers, unaffected by culture and belief, even though this is not true. And every scientist has their own background, perspective, and bias that they bring to the table. So healthcare workers with known religious beliefs, even Christian healthcare workers of the dominant religion, are sometimes cast as biased and unreliable scientists and may be disparaged by colleagues. Religious or spiritual patients are sometimes seen by physicians as silly, superstitious, irrational, troublesome, complicated, or even mentally ill. This framing makes doctors see patients who require religious accommodations as burdensome. One example of this that I see unfortunately quite frequently is people who speak disparagingly about religious Jews who for religious reasons want their loved ones to be full code, even when the healthcare team thinks that such so-called heroic measures won't be helpful or likely to work. I see lots of eye rolling and sighing when it comes to talking to folks with these sorts of beliefs. Another example that comes to mind is when religious Jewish patients don't want to be transported on Shabbat, on the Jewish Sabbath, from Friday evening to Saturday evening. Their requests, or the requests of their family members, often also elicit eye rolls, when non-religious requests for schedule accommodations often do not result in such contemptuous reactions. It's easier to ask for an extra day because your colleague, your family member is driving in from Burlington than because you're having a religious holiday. Being conscious of our social instinct and our societal instinct to belittle religious requests will help us approach religious patients with compassion. I'll pass it over to Joanna to discuss the conspiracy theories about which she is tragically an expert.
Thanks so much, Ariel. So this third concept has to do with those narratives, tropes, and conspiracy theories that we've already alluded to. As we've discussed, anti-Semitism is based on deep-seated prejudices and tropes that have their origins in historical conspiracy theories and other stereotypes. This can lead to wider, more systemic forms of anti-Semitism that then get incorporated into the stories that are told to this day. One of the most pervasive conspiracy theories of all time stems from a fraudulent document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, published in Russia in 1903. This document claims to describe a Jewish plan for global domination. It's a screed that is a depiction of some of the worst anti-Semitic stereotypes at the time and was attributed falsely to Jewish authors. It's since been proven that such attribution is categorically false. It was taught to German children in school well into the 1930s, and astoundingly, for a long period in the mid-20th century, pretty much right up until the end of the Second World War, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was the second best-selling book of all time, after only the Bible. This book is still incredibly popular and believed to be true among anti-Semitic groups today. This narrative that Jews were conspiring against the state, that they sought to control the economy and media, that they sowed seeds of religious conflict, might sound familiar to you, and you're not wrong. These conspiracy theories persist in different ways. Maybe they've taken on new inflections in today's world, but we can see them in politics or the practice of medicine, as you've heard. The landscape of anti-Semitism has certainly changed over the years, but some things do remain consistent. So, for example, with the advent of technological advancements, smartphones, the internet, old anti-Semitic myths and stereotypes have found new ways to spread. Anti-Semitic content tends to be popular because it garners responses, whether positive or negative. Then the online algorithms gather data about these harmful posts and popularize more like them. So if you watch one, the algorithm will suggest another, perhaps more extreme one, and so on and so forth. Conspiracy theories also filter into each other online. So if you believe in one conspiracy theory, for example, that the Earth is flat, you're more likely to believe in other ones. For example, that Jews control governmental and educational systems in order to corrupt children with false information about the roundness of the Earth. This mixing of worldviews was on full display at the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally in 2017, in which white supremacists armed with tiki torches took to the streets to oppose the dismantling of a Confederate statue. Support for this rally was stirred up online first, and when the crowds arrived in person, one of the chants that they shouted repeatedly was, "Jews will not replace us." This language and this mingling of anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism falls directly in line with the conspiracy theory known as the Great Replacement Theory. The Great Replacement Theory is essentially a way to promote white supremacy by targeting and vilifying Muslim communities, communities of color, Jews, anyone who represents something racially other than the white ethno-state. White supremacists believe that immigrants, largely perceived as Black and brown people, will overrun the rightful white majority. But who is it that opens the door for those communities? Who is it that's pulling the strings behind the scenes, that wants to see the white state overturned, that has already infiltrated the deepest corners of our society? The Jews, of course, in this formulation. And this takes us back to some of the old tropes of anti-Semitism that you can encounter throughout history. It relies on the belief that Jews are involved in some grand international conspiracy to garner power and control. Anti-Semitism becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy under the Great Replacement theory. Any negative thing that a Jewish person does confirms that they are lowly, ignorant, useless, unfit, and not to be trusted. And any positive thing that a Jewish person does confirms that they can insinuate themselves anywhere to seize dominance, that they are taking the rightful place of white people, that they actually do have plans to undermine society for their own gains. Conspiracy theories tend to prove themselves in this way, and anti-Semitism via the Great Replacement theory is no exception. But that does make it incredibly difficult to combat. The Great Replacement theory is one anti-Semitic narrative that has gotten a lot of attention in the news lately, but there are many others. Often they take the form of code words or dog whistles, things that might seem innocuous on the surface, but are in fact signals of anti-Semitism for those in the know. Because the perpetrators of this kind of anti-Semitism aren't seen to be directly spewing racist opinions or posting swastikas, for example, they can fly under the radar of regulators. So, for example, 88, HH, and honk honk all have the same meaning. HH stands for Heil Hitler. Honk honk is another way of saying it without being obvious, and because H is the 8th letter of the alphabet, 88 essentially means the same thing. You may also have encountered those echoes online, the triple parentheses that you see on your screen there, which are often placed around a person's name in order to mark them as a Jew or as someone who should be on the receiving end of anti-Semitic vitriol. The echoes are meant to signal the person's innate degeneracy as a Jew echoing throughout history. Words and phrases like the New World Order and cabal also have anti-Semitic origins and are often used as ways for anti-Semites to signal that someone or something is Jewish without having to actually say the words out loud. Similarly, whenever George Soros is invoked or references are made to globalists, internationalists, or people being cosmopolitan, there's a good bet these words are being used to represent a perceived Jewish threat. And increasingly, when a person or organization is labeled as having Zionist aspirations of control, whether or not they have any ties to Israel, such labeling is largely based in anti-Semitism, as you'll hear from Ariel. These notions filter into the popular media that we consume for entertainment, and oftentimes people don't even realize that anti-Semitic images or narratives have been incorporated into their favorite TV show, movie, or website. You can see on the screen the images of the money-loving Ferengi from Star Trek, for example, or the goblins from Harry Potter. These images consciously or unconsciously play into anti-Semitic stereotypes about greedy, mercenary Jews who only care about wealth. Similarly, you can see an image from Fox News there of Hillary Clinton with a Star of David stamped over her, as if Jewish endorsement had manufactured her platform. At hospitals in Toronto, sometimes Jewish people who work with charitable funds or finances are assumed to be there because, quote, you people are good with money. Not only is the othering language, you people, incredibly offensive, but the stereotype that Jews have some deep affinity and desire for money is, as the history proves, completely false. A lot of these old tropes were unfortunately only strengthened during the pandemic, at which time we saw a huge rise in anti-Semitic behavior, both online and in person. And Ariel is going to share some examples of that.
So indeed, the COVID pandemic makes it clear how all of this relates to healthcare. Many narratives about whose fault the pandemic was tracks directly with prejudiced narratives about Jews that date back to medieval times. During the Black Plague and other medieval plagues, Jews were accused of causing and spreading disease because they were thought to be dirty, malevolent, and would profit off of the deaths of others during the plagues, so it was thought. This often led to violent attacks and massacres of Jewish communities as a way of treating the supposed source of these plagues. During the COVID pandemic, it's incredible how similar the anti-Semitic narratives that cropped up were to those past conspiracy theories. There were those that accused Jews of creating COVID as a biological weapon to kill off Gentiles as part of a plot for global domination or to profit off of vaccines. Synagogues were accused of being particularly dangerous sites of the spread of COVID when they were actually no more likely to spread COVID than any other religious group or indeed any community gathering. That same narrative of plague spreaders, poisoners, profiteers came back strong because indeed they never left. These stories are sadly part of the fabric of our society. And these harmful narratives affect real people, promote real violence and discrimination, and they are so hard to combat because these are some of the oldest and most pervasive stories in the world. I'm thinking about that trope in TV shows of the shadowy board of who knows who are controlling everything. I suddenly realized while Joanna is talking, those are Jewish analogs, right? And the first step in fighting these narratives is knowing about them so they can be identified when they arise. And yes, I acknowledge that this is perhaps the most horrifying slide I've ever had in a PowerPoint presentation. Unfortunately, Jewish colleagues of ours shared how a couple of years ago they saw friends and colleagues in Toronto hospitals posting, quote, anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist imagery on social media with swastikas and Jews demonized. Social media feels entirely divorced from work, a place where you can be yourself and engage in your own interests and political beliefs. But these anti-Semitic social media posts really highlight how hurt and unsafe social media can make people feel at work. To see your friends and colleagues posting dehumanizing and even violent messages about your religion or ethnicity is very damaging and marginalizing, of course. And this is, of course, a post by Kanye West where a Jewish star is merged with a swastika, obviously anti-Semitic. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. You may be asking in your head, what about legitimate criticisms of Israel? Are they anti-Semitic? Am I not allowed to criticize Israel for fear of being labeled anti-Semitic? The answer is, legitimate criticism of the actions of the Israeli government are acceptable. But be careful, because there is unfortunately so much anti-Israel rhetoric that is also anti-Semitic. Take this comic, for instance. An anti-Semitic caricature of a Jew with a big nose and a yellow star that Jews were forced to wear during the Holocaust. The suggestion that Jews take from impoverished children to give to Israel, playing on the money-grubbing Jew stereotype. The stereotype that Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are to the country that they live in. That their greed makes them not care about poor people. There is so much here. This would not be characterized as a legitimate criticism of Israel. This is anti-Semitism. So how do we figure it out? How do we figure out which is which? Ask yourself, would I ever ask a Chinese person to renounce China's inhumane treatment of the Muslim Uyghurs in order to be accepted as a person worthy of discussion with? That helps us recognize how anti-Semitic it is to ask Jews to renounce Israel in order to be perceived as the right kind of Jew. Indeed, my sister, who's quite a prolific human, was invited to join a poetry slam exhibiting marginalized voices. And the organizers said right to her, "We invited you because you understand your privilege. You won't take up space. You are the right kind of Jew." Then ask yourself, am I accusing Israel using classic anti-Jewish conspiracy theories? To say Israel controls the world economy, or Israel profits off of war and pandemics, or Israel murders Palestinian babies on purpose, is just to replace the word Jews with the word Israel in these classic anti-Semitic rhetoric that have been leveled against Jews since medieval times. Ask yourself, would I say the same things about other countries that I perceive as doing bad things? If not, why not? One of the ways in which anti-Semitism is expressed and masquerades as okay in plain sight is through the demonization and redefinition of the word Zionism. That it means that you want to kill babies or murder Muslims. That saying you want to destroy Zionism means you're just fighting against these straw man perspectives. But just as we don't tell LGBTQ people what queer means and how it should be defined, we have to look to folks who identify as Zionist to find out what Zionism actually means. That principle of self-identification and defining your own self and set of community terminology. Zionism means a belief that the Jewish people should have a country to call their own. Being a Zionist doesn't mean taking a perspective on the current Israeli government or its actions, nor does it mean having an opinion on the existence of a Palestinian state. To state the obvious, someone can be a Zionist and not be pro-murder. You can be a Zionist and believe that Israel has a right to exist while also upholding Palestinian human rights and the right to self-determination, which, spoiler alert, is a perspective held by the panelists today. That we believe very strongly that one should be able to criticize Israel's government, and also that it should not be wiped from the face of the earth. Another example, Roger Waters, famous for being in Pink Floyd and for being an outspoken critic of Israel, dressed up as a Nazi for a concert in Berlin in May of this year with an inflatable pig with a Jewish Star of David on it to protest the treatment of Palestinians by Israel. This would very much be another clear example of anti-Semitism masquerading as anti-Israel protest, and I'm very sad. I loved Pink Floyd as a kid. What am I going to listen to now? One last story from a Jewish colleague here in Toronto who told us how they were repeatedly for the past 4 years approached and asked about the Middle East conflict, saying, why can't your people just stop all the murder and be peaceful? These questions were always asked in private and always after hours. When the person who was asked these questions approached HR about it, she was told to turn the other cheek and stop being so sensitive. Is this anti-Semitic? Absolutely. Jews in Toronto or anywhere else are not responsible for the actions of Jews around the world. The implication that Jews are murdering and a barrier to peace through their existence is anti-Semitic. If you're about to ascribe beliefs or responsibility about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to Jewish people in your own life or online, pump the brakes. Chances are that action is likely about to be anti-Semitic. One question we've gotten a lot at a few of these sessions is grappling with the paradox that anti-Semitism exists in both politically right-wing circles as well as left-wing environments. We heard from Joanna how Jews are perceived by white supremacists as the antithesis of white, no matter how they look, and as having even more privilege and power than the white majority by the other side. We have seen how Jews have been perceived as the supreme oppressors while being subjected to persecution now and throughout history. We've seen how the right have perceived Jews as this corrupting force in society bent on bringing down the status quo. And we've heard a bit about how on the left, Jews have been perceived as trying to take attention away from other structurally marginalized groups through their whining about anti-Semitism. So you see, we've talked a lot of this question out already. I'd like to just add one more story to highlight this dichotomy of expression of anti-Semitism on the right versus the left through a story from my brother's life, actually, which he said that I could share with you today. So my brother was on a Via Rail train home from Montreal to Toronto. He was sleeping in a window seat when suddenly a man sat down beside him and woke him up. The man asked him, "Are you a Muslim?" My brother said no, and immediately realized the danger that he was in. So he starts trying to make small talk. He says to the man, "Hey, are you from Montreal?" The man said, "No, I'm German. My father moved from Germany after World War II. So, are you a Jew? Are you someone that I hate?" he said to my brother. My brother said no and tried to escape the man, but was trapped in the window seat as the man made moves to be more and more aggressive. My brother was able to signal to a Via Rail attendant, and the man was hauled off the train and actually arrested on the platform at the next stop. My brother could hear the guy shouting through the window, "I knew that guy was a Jew. I could tell by his Jew nose." My brother was completely shaken by this experience. He had PTSD symptoms from it for years after. And for some time, he didn't want to travel lest he find himself in a similar situation. So a little while later, he was talking to his friends, his close friends, about his experience and connecting his experience to the experiences of anti-Semitism that our family had experienced through history, including the Holocaust. And one of his friends became enraged, yelling at him, "Anti-Semitism doesn't exist. The Holocaust was a long time ago. When you talk like this, it makes you sound weak." And this so-called friend, who was also my brother's musical group's recording engineer, continued to belittle my brother's experiences of anti-Semitism in the months that followed. And this abuse contributed to my brother leaving the band and moving to New York. This story of my brother lays out a couple classic threads of right versus left-wing anti-Semitism. First, the overt expression of anti-Semitism from the right, and then this toxic dismissal of anti-Semitism that we sometimes see on the left. A recent example of anti-Semitism on the left comes from Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a Democratic presidential candidate in the United States, who propagated the conspiracy theory that COVID was an ethnically targeted bioweapon genetically engineered to disproportionately kill certain races, but not to kill Ashkenazi Jews or Chinese people. So you can see on the left and on the right, these same stories garner belief. They are so pervasive and so captivating in our society, and as we've demonstrated, so dangerous. So what can we do about it? This is in relation to both our patients and our colleagues. So first, challenging assumptions and biases, which is essentially engaging in critical reflection, asking ourselves, why do I believe what I believe? Why do I make the assumptions that I do? And in doing so, we can challenge the dominant conception of normality. So, for example, the Holocaust, please excuse my Freudian slip. The holiday season is in December. Is that normal? Is that true in all cultures around the world? Everyone says that the Jews control the media. Why do I believe that conspiracy theory? We've learned to recognize that horrifying lies, for example, Obama is a Muslim sleeper cell bent on destroying America. That's a racist lie. We can identify that. And so too can we learn to recognize that conspiracy theories about Jews are anti-Semitic lies. Finally, we should reflect on how healthcare providers' power and privilege allow us to do harm and increase marginalization of religious groups. But by the same token, we have the power to use our privilege to advocate for recognizing the needs of those who are marginalized. Number 2, be open, inquisitive, and receptive to feedback. It is so important to be conscious of the personal trauma of our patients. We are so embroiled in their lives as essential healthcare providers, so to be conscious of the fact that, for example, around 30% of Jews over 75 in Toronto are Holocaust survivors, and that children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors like me very much still carry intergenerational trauma from the murder of our families. To be conscious of these facts allow us to be more likely to provide sensitive, trauma-informed care to our patients. But no one can know what a person needs just by looking at them, even if the healthcare provider belongs to the patient's same religious group. They should not assume that they know what the patient needs, because people and their religious expressions are incredibly heterogeneous, as we've heard about the very diverse backgrounds and expressions of Jewish people from Joanna earlier. I encourage you to be open to learning about other people's religious practices and spiritual needs, inquire when you don't understand, and engage in dialogue to understand how their beliefs and customs might affect their care needs. So dietary restrictions like needing kosher food, religious beliefs around end-of-life care, and prayer and spiritual requirements are some factors that may affect a person's healthcare plan. Perhaps most importantly, if you make a mistake, say, thank you for correcting me, and make a point of doing better next time. And these concepts tie in with CASLPO's Guide for Equitable and Inclusive Services, where the second principle outlines practicing with cultural humility, recommending self-reflection, and interrogation of one's own beliefs, biases, and perspectives. And we're very pleased to be collaborating on this work together. Number 3 is accommodating religious and spiritual needs. And this is in some ways the simplest, right? We can do a lot of good by simply rescheduling meetings to not coincide with an important religious holiday. Just there are available calendars where you can see the different religious holidays and where they fall on our Gregorian calendar. We can ensure inpatients receive appropriate food, or have inclusive events that don't only include alcohol, for example, that might exclude those of Muslim tradition. Help a patient or colleague find a prayer space. One story that the folks at CASLPO shared with us was of one of your colleagues asking their manager for time off for the Jewish high holidays. And the manager made a comment that, well, fine, okay, but you know, so-and-so, another Jewish colleague, didn't ask for so much time off. This painful microaggression is a great example of a few of these key concepts. One, that it isn't enough to just provide time off, that you can do harm by casting aspersions while making accommodations, which colleagues of mine and I have faced similar things when asking for kosher food, for example. Two, that folks who advocate for their right to engage in their minority religion are often cast as burdensome, which we talked about before. And three, that religious practices are very heterogeneous, that just because one Jewish person can celebrate religious holidays, another Jewish person may only be adhering to certain traditions and maybe will work on a certain Jewish holiday and not on another one. Both practices are valid, and no person has a right to cast judgment on the personal religious practices of other people. Number four, being an ally. If you witness or are victim of subtle or overt instances of individual or systemic racism or religious discrimination, take the opportunity to be an ally or advocate for yourself if you're comfortable doing so. In the moment or afterwards, if it isn't possible in the moment, say with tact to the person who's acted discriminatorily, "This is not okay," and explain why. "Hey, I don't know if you realized, but that comment played on a common stereotype about Judaism, and it came off as inadvertently hurtful." And then either in the moment or afterwards, reach out to the person who was victimized and let them know you validate their experience and offer a listening ear and a pledge to improve things. As you would for any other form of discrimination, use the reporting process of your institution or organization, whether speaking to an ombudsperson or manager, or using a formal reporting process to report instances of mistreatment anonymously or not, depending on your comfort level. Support, advocate for, and launch initiatives geared towards addressing ways in which institutions, hospitals, schools marginalize and discriminate against Jewish people, and encourage others to do the same, please. These concepts are also highlighted well in CASLPO's Guide for Equitable and Inclusive Services, where Principle 4 outlines the power of allyship in supporting victims of discrimination and advocating for social change, which is what we're trying to do here. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope that we have made very clear how anti-Semitism is a significant problem in healthcare and in society and is rapidly increasing, how recognition of the history and the ways that these stereotypes are perpetuated is the first step in combating it, recognizing those harmful narratives and how they run through. You can see me, I'm realizing them in real time, even as I am so embroiled in talking about these things. Calling out anti-Semitism, supporting victims, and raising voices against perpetrators will hopefully help reverse this worrying trend. So again, hopefully we've fulfilled our learning objectives, and thank you very much for listening, and we're really looking forward to a good discussion in our question section. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lefkowitz and Dr. Krongel. That was fantastic. I do have some questions for you, so I'm going to pull up my notes very quickly, and I encourage our viewers, there is still time to enter your questions, so please feel free to do so. One of the questions that we've received is in the context of working within a larger healthcare organization that's mandating diversity training, but it's not including a conversation about anti-Semitism. So the question is, how do you address this, or how do you bring this up with the organizers to include these types of discussions?
Dr. Cooper, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'll jump in here because this is something that I've unfortunately had to do a fair bit over the past few years. I had the privilege of serving the faculty for a year, faculty of medicine for a year as a senior advisor on anti-Semitism, and one of my roles was to identify this issue in various healthcare organizations that were affiliated with faculty and try to bring an awareness of the need for anti-Semitism to be included. And it's hard. Partly you have to diagnose the problem in the sense of, is it being left out because people say, hey, I have lots of Jewish friends, I know lots of Jews, and I didn't know that was going on. Sure, I'll bring it in. That's easy. Is it I know nothing about this, but if you convince me and teach me, maybe I'll listen. That's also doable. Unfortunately, sometimes we also bring this forward. And I would encourage people to both, whether they're Jewish or not, to bring this forward, because I think this is a space for allyship. But sometimes when you bring this forward, what you end up with is some of the rhetoric that Ariel and Joanna talked about, this idea that anti-Semitism isn't real, or that there isn't space for Jews in EDI. And I've encountered that multiple times in the system, as have my Jewish colleagues bringing this forward. I've had Jewish colleagues bravely stand up at the end of EDI sessions and say, you know, you've completely left this out, and been told to sit back down. And unfortunately, it really depends on where that sits within an organization, how high that attitude goes. You know, we've been really lucky. CASLPO reached out to us and wanted us to come talk about this, and we're really grateful for that. But there are organizations that have categorically continued to refuse to engage. Sometimes that changes with different leadership, and sometimes that can be changed with more systemic structural changes. So, you know, if this is something that various colleges are taking on, then other colleges look around and say, maybe actually we should be thinking about this too. So it's about allyship, about leading in the area, that if you have a voice or an ability to help your institution think about things, bringing it forward. And hopefully, mostly it's about education. So, you know, I know that all of us are always willing to come talk to leaders at different organizations to say, hey, this is actually a problem. We have material, we have reading materials that we're happy to have people share and read. And so I don't know if that's a help. That's not maybe an uplifting answer, but hopefully it's a practical and helpful answer.
I apologize, I couldn't find the unmute button. I think that that is really spot on. I think there's a bit of a shared responsibility for all of us, regardless of where we come from, what communities or backgrounds. We can support each other and help each other. So I think in the last slides, Dr. Lefkowitz talked about being that ally and offering that support. And I think Dr. Cooper, your comments flow very well with those types of ideas. I have another question. It's a little bit, it's a little bit of content here, but I'm going to try and trim it down. So one of our viewers offered their own experience being asked whether they were Jewish when speaking to a healthcare provider, and originally taken aback by, I guess, the way the question was asked. They did answer in the affirmative, but also asked why, and the practitioner said that there is a higher rate of occurrence for a particular medical condition amongst the Ashkenazi Jewish community. And so she understood ultimately why the question was asked. But leading up to the question for you as our panel, how would you recommend practitioners ask about a Jewish identity in potentially a less threatening way, especially when it's relevant to the care of the patient?
I can take a first stab. I teach the medical students clinical skills, and we talk about signposting and how important signposting is, right? You come in with a sore knee and I say, so any recent sexual partners? And you're like, what? And I say, oh, by the way, I'm asking because there's a risk of, gonococcal arthritis, and gonorrhea comes from sex. Ah, now I get it, right? I have been asked many times by patients and others if I am Jewish. And then I don't breathe for a bit because I'm not sure if they're asking because they, like the Jews or hate the Jews. And so I've faced it many times, and it's hard to hide with a name like mine and a face like mine. And so I very much sympathize with your colleague who asked the question, because it can be very nerve-wracking because you don't know why they're asking. So were I to be teaching a student on how to ask such a question, I would say there are certain ethnic links with certain diseases. For example, the BRCA1 and 2 genetic disorders that can precipitate breast and ovarian cancer are more common in certain communities, including the Ashkenazi Jewish community. Are you a member of that ethnicity? Oh, thank you. I think that might be a place to start.
I don't know, Dr. Krongel or Dr. Cooper, did you want to add anything? No, okay. I have another question, and this is really, I think, touching upon the education system. So not just the education system with respect to healthcare providers, but I think in a general sense. Can you speak to how Holocaust education and anti-Semitism is potentially present, or how, maybe in your opinion, it should be present in our educational system, but also focusing specifically on how that education system is targeted towards our healthcare providers and how they're learning about the history of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism and how they can carry that forward to support their patients?
Why don't I start with the public education system, and then maybe Dr. Lefkowitz can talk about what he's teaching in the medical school, because he's doing a lot of that right now. And Dr. Krongold, you probably have some thoughts about the public system as well. Interestingly, this past year, the provincial government introduced a new requirement for Holocaust education in middle school. and that was, pardon me, and that was introduced in response to a rise in incidents of pretty aggressive anti-Semitism, like middle schoolers giving Hitler salutes to their Jewish teacher in the Toronto District School Board and in the York District School Board. Which are of course the regions in Ontario where most Jews live, and therefore where most of these incidents get reported. And that's been hailed by many as a good first step, and it is an important first step. It's very important that Holocaust education, though, not be taught as a historical fact, in the sense that not just as a historical fact, in the sense that sometimes we teach Holocaust education as a way to not then teach about contemporary anti-Semitism. So we talk about, this happened to those Jews back then, and then people say, oh, those Jews still whining about their Holocaust, and they don't allow it to be connected to the ways in which that same anti-Semitism continues to pervade to this day. The Holocaust is an extreme manifestation of a long-standing and ongoing form of hatred. And so if that isn't made clear, there are ways in which Holocaust education taught by people who aren't that up on it can actually make contemporary anti-Semitism seem less real or less meaningful to learners. There's been a lot of education done with teachers in the public system. So for example, we've had many principals and teachers taken to visit concentration camps so that they have that context to be able to come back and teach. On the other hand, I still hear from people very active in multiple school boards and schools in Toronto that their leadership has asked them to avoid talking about anti-Semitism, that they're supposed to check if their students need any other food accommodation, but kosher isn't allowed, that they're supposed to check about other holidays, but they're not allowed to talk about Jewish holidays. And so even the same teachers who are then being told, oh, teach about the Holocaust because it's mandatory in the curriculum. So I think it's a good step, but it's not the same as anti-Semitism education. And if we see what's going on, for example, in the Ottawa District School Board, I know CASLPO is the whole province, right? So we see what's going on in Ottawa. They actually just have a new advisor to talk about anti-Semitism as one of the equity advisors. They're the first school board to have that. And that person is receiving daily death threats, both because of her anti-Semitism work and also because she supports the LGBTQ community very openly and is constantly getting threats related to that. So it's a good start, but it's not really a panacea, nor does it really mean that people coming into their health professions training know anything about Jews or about anti-Semitism.
Can I jump in before before we do the healthcare setting? Just because reading the news over the last week or two, it's been really interesting to look at book banning in public school systems, and especially the banning of certain books such as The Diary of Anne Frank, if it can be believed, as perfectly exemplifying the idea that Ariel and I have been talking about anti-Semitism coming from both the left and the right. So oftentimes in the news these days, we hear about, especially in the United States, books being banned and the culture wars and not wanting to expose children to things that they are not ready for, etc. And one of the things that has been targeted is Holocaust education. So texts like the Diary of Anne Frank have been targeted and banned in many schools, coming from this right-wing perspective. And I think not only because it talks about the Holocaust, but also because it talks about a young girl getting her period and experiencing her own, sexuality. These are not seen as acceptable things in school, and that's definitely coming from the right. But just last week, the Peel District School Board had a whole controversy about banning texts from before 2008, including the Diary of Anne Frank. And that was because their sort of mandate is to include books and literature that reflect the diversity of their student body and that sort of have an aim of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so the Diary of Anne Frank was scrapped under those, pretexts. But it's really fascinating to see how obvious it is that anti-Semitism and studying the Holocaust does not count as an example of studying discrimination or an example of studying diversity. So it's sort of like from either end, these texts can't actually be included in public education. And that's sort of a bigger problem, is that it's sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. And I think that, just this current issue is a real strong example of that.
I'll try to be brief. Everyone said wonderful things. I wondered if Dr. Cooper was going to allude to the book People Love Dead Jews, which is really on this exact topic. That the same exists in the Black and Indigenous communities here and south of the border, where you're maybe allowed to say slavery and Jim Crow laws, but you got to say that racism ends in 1969, lest you be perceived as starting your own culture war, and they fight a culture war with a culture war. I won't say too much more about it. In my own work here at University of Toronto, I am the lead and lecturer on lessons for physicians from the Holocaust. So teaching medical students about Holocaust studies, and it's very interesting to see the responses where many students say, I didn't think this was going to be relevant to me, and I was wrong. Thank you for showing that to me. What I speak about in that lecture is lessons for physicians that come out of the Holocaust. So the Holocaust is not just the largest genocide of all time, but also one that was perpetrated by physicians, planning and executed by physicians who were figuring out the best ways to kill people. And so we as physicians have to look that history in the face and understand what leads somebody who believes that they are fulfilling their duty to protect human life to kill people. And it's a good discussion, so to speak. And it's about analyzing and fighting our biases and standing up for what's right and fighting against dehumanizing discourse. And I don't talk a lot about anti-Semitism in it, except for when it's 100% necessary. And one, I have the luxury of also being the lecturer for religious discrimination in healthcare. But two, I'm so conscious of the backlash. I alluded to those students who said, why should we learn about this genocide? Why don't we learn about genocide in general? And I think it speaks to the fact that we don't want to talk about anti-Semitism when we don't have to. So we're really here hoping that it lands with people, because we do think it's important, and at the same time are afraid to talk about it for fear of all the ways in which we're maligned for doing so.
I think that's really helpful information, and it leads me conveniently to another question that's come in from one of our viewers. They are curious essentially about helping and being an ally to members in the Jewish community when they themselves are in the Black community, and they're wondering how, or maybe perhaps whether there's room for improvement where there are potentially two distinct cultural groups or two distinct social groups, perhaps working side by side. How do they support each other to kind of tack on that larger institutional racism in a meaningful way? So I'm sorry, I think I fumbled that a bit, but I think that the question is, how do we come together, sharing our own experiences, even if we come from different walks of life, to address the type of institutional racism that we, regardless of who we are, I think see as Dr. Lepkowitz, I think you highlighted, as being an other or an outsider.
Yeah, did you want to?
Yeah, sure. I think first of all, that's a phenomenal question. because that's really the question of the hour. The question of the hour is, how do all of the equity deserving groups across Canadian society, leave the rest of the world for a moment, let's focus on Canada or Ontario, how do all the equity deserving groups across Canadian society come together to create a more just world, instead of for each of our groups to try to just make our own lives a little bit better? And there's so many ways to think about how to answer your question. One is to remind us all that there is a huge, long history, and now I'll leave Canada for a second, but especially in the United States with the civil rights movement, of Jews and Black people working together for civil rights. There were senior rabbis and many Jews who came to walk across the bridge at Selma with Martin Luther King. There were many of the freedom riders. We talk about the white freedom riders. Most of those white freedom riders weren't white by the way anyone in the South would have thought them to be, and many of them were Jewish. Jews from the Northeast who decided that this was time to go help and be an ally. This was part of American Jewish consciousness and North American Jewish consciousness until very recently. This idea that this was part of what we did as Jews was to be part of the American civil rights movement and the civil rights movement more generally. And that was part of the legacy of how many of us were either Holocaust survivors or related to people who had survived the Holocaust, or who had died in the Holocaust, and our deep entrenchment in this belief in social justice and human rights. And I think that history has been lost. I think that sense of allyship, of siblinghood, brotherhood, sisterhood has disappeared. And we have forgotten that really we're all fighting for something that we're all only going to get if we work at it together. So I'll put that as one part of the answer. The other part of an answer that I will put out there is, I know many people who are members of both the Black and the Jewish community. And people tend to believe they're Black because they look at their skin, but they often don't even believe that they're Jewish. And I know them, I have prayed with them, I have eaten with them, I've shared many parts of my life with members of the Black Jewish community over the years, and they face a lot of issues in moving between those communities, feeling that they have to choose one or the other in terms of what kind of discrimination that they can talk about or fight. And I don't mention that because I think that there's a greater onus on them, but just to say that there actually isn't as big a divide as maybe we think there is, when a third of North American Jews, or a third of American Jews is what the statistic is, are actually people of color. And so I think thinking more about how we can do work together, and certainly in the Faculty of Medicine, I'm pleased to say that there are many members of the Jewish and Black and other equity deserving communities who are deliberately working together. There are people who aren't part of that coalition, but there are definitely people who are and who want to be. And I think some of us take great strength and heartening from that.
I would maybe just add really quickly, the idea that sort of division among these different groups only serves the oppressive agenda, like that only serves the sort of white supremacist agenda. Toni Morrison has this amazing quotation where she says, if you can only be tall because somebody else is on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And that's what racism is, that's what anti-Semitism is, and sort of pitting these groups against each other only serves to create more of those divisions. So I think absolutely that coming together, that allyship, and that realization, just that sort of naming of those structures of hierarchy and discrimination is certainly a place to start. And yeah, we're so grateful to have that here today.
I am very cognizant of time, so I'm sorry that we won't be able to get to every question today, but we will endeavor to answer them. I want to thank you so much, Drs. Cooper, Krongel, Lefkowitz. I think today's session was impactful but also provided our viewers, and then I can say myself, with I think some tangible tools and knowledge pieces going forward. I hope there are many ways that we can support each other, and I think today's session helps contribute to that. So as a reminder, today's session has been recorded and will be posted on the website. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. And just as a reminder that we are working on more sessions to discuss discrimination within our society. So please keep your eyes open. I want to thank our speakers again for such an amazing conversation and discussion today. And I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you all.